I'm going to read to you from a section of legislation passed nearly 10 years ago. Sounds boring, I know. It's not. This is our main law governing the impacts of social media and user-generated content. Handily, it has a section which explains what the Act is intended to combat. So this is from the Harmful Digital Communications Act 2015. These are the principles. This is what it aspires to do. I'm reading from the Act here. The Act defines harmful digital communications as any electronic communication that causes serious emotional distress to an individual. It outlines 10 communication principles that prohibit digital communications that disclose sensitive personal facts about an individual, are threatening, intimidating, or menacing, are grossly offensive to a reasonable person in the victim's position, are indecent or obscene, are used to harass an individual, to make a false allegation, contain matters that are published in breach of confidence, incite or encourage anyone to send a message to someone with the intent to cause harm, incite or encourage another individual to commit suicide, denigrate an individual by reasons of their colour, race, ethnic or national origins, religion, gender, sexual orientation, or disability. That's the end quote. I don't know about you, but that seems like a pretty good description of what you'll find every day on X and Facebook. And you don't need to look far on Instagram, TikTok, or YouTube to find whole veins of content which could plausibly be in violation of many of those principles. Yet the platforms seem to grow more powerful by the day, and as they do, our ability to regulate them in ways which might make them better places or less troublesome for us as a country seem to melt away. Regular listeners to this podcast will know that I have a particular issue with the disparity between the way the big tech platforms are regulated and the way news media is regulated. To raise one simple point, if the news media gets a fact wrong, there are multiple systems set up to penalise us for that. No such systems exist to govern large tech platforms. If anything, the reverse seems to be true. Because there is so much conflicting content on platforms, governments and corporations go out of their way to show up there and buy advertising space to sort of correct the record in many instances. This is a complex issue, so I've invited two guests who know a lot more about it than me. We're going to talk today about three related issues. One is how you might plausibly regulate social media and big tech so that we can hold the upside without experiencing such huge downsides. The second is how these laws interact with the trade agreements we've signed. And finally, some realpolitik. How much can we really do with Trump in office and expressing a radical new trade doctrine? Charles, Tom, tēnā kōrua, and welcome to the fold. I wonder if you could start by just introducing yourselves and maybe with a particular emphasis on how your experience and interest intersect with a conversation like this.
Sure, thanks for having me. I'm a long-time listener, a big fan. My name's Tom Barraclough, and I'm the founder and a director of the Brainbox Institute, which is a tech policy think tank. We've been working since 2018 on a range of topics to do with basically the intersection of technology and law. More recently, our main interests are in things like AI and automated systems, digital public infrastructure, and then also thinking about empowerment-based approaches to dealing with the impact of digital technologies like media literacy, digital literacy, AI literacy, things like that.
Fascinating. Looking forward to getting into it. And Charles?
Look, thank you for having me as well. My name's Charles Finny. I'm a partner at the government relations firm Saunders Unsworth in Wellington. Can I just begin with a disclaimer? I actually have no clients in this space. Everything I say is my personal view. I've got no government positions at this point in time, so I can't speak on behalf of this or any other government. But I am really interested in this space. I have in the past served on the Film Commission Board for 7 years, and I've been partly involved, or slightly involved in the formulation of some of our current policy settings. And I had actually just finished reading the Ministry of Culture and Heritage discussion paper that's, I think, at the centre of what we're about to be talking about when you got in contact about participating in this podcast. So I will be submitting, but it'll be my personal views as opposed to the views of any client or anyone else.
Anyone who's going deep on an MCH discussion document is very welcome on this podcast, I should say. Tom, do you want to start by basically giving us a bit of a top line of the most material legislation we currently have around large technology platforms, and give a sense of whether it's kind of working as it was intended, I suppose?
Yeah, part of the difficulty of assessing something like this is that the actual nature of the products and services that we're talking about are so diverse. So if you think about, I think about when we're talking about sort of platform regulation, I think in my mind, definitely, and I know in the minds of probably policymakers and others, we kind of default to the idea of Facebook probably as it was in like 2012. Like that's probably what we think about as social media now, when in reality, a lot of the sort of platforms that people are probably using on a regular basis are less even about, well, they're still user-generated content, but they're probably more just straight algorithmic feeds of stuff. It's less about what their friends are up to. It's just sort of content being pushed out. So I think the nature of the products that we're talking about are quite different to what they were a while ago. And I do think that has some bearing on the way we think about the legislation and regulation that we have in place. So in New Zealand in particular, the two that really jump to mind for me are our Films, Videos, Publications Classification Act, which really deals with the really sharp end of objectionable content. And that's kind of got a quite defined meaning. It covers, the really sort of black and white nasty stuff like, bestiality, promotion of terrorism, extreme violence. And that's sort of sharp enough that even possessing an objectionable publication is a criminal offence. And I think it's imprisonable by up to 14 years. So if you think about that, that's pretty severe in terms of the way that we regulate online content and the way that it's distributed and even possessed. The other really big one to think about in this space is the Harmful Digital Communications Act. And that's kind of a funny one because it's less about regulating the platforms and the products themselves and more about regulating the way that people use them. Particularly on a kind of individual to individual basis. So, it's been around since about 2015, I think, and you'll probably know the history of some of that better than I do. But a lot of it even almost came out of the, regulating the blogosphere as much as social media. But that's probably the one that most directly relates to social media platforms. And that's one of the ones that actually has a kind of takedown regime and also has a intermediary liability component too, which I understand is something that we'll get onto later. But other than that, we've kind of got this patchwork of stuff that sort of applies, sort of doesn't apply. You can think about more general types of law as well, like, the Fair Trading Act, for example, or contract law that governs terms of service and things like that.
Just in terms of the Harmful Digital Communications Bill, the fact that it is understood as being an individual to individual relationship with the platform almost neutral. But as you said earlier, the fact that these things are algorithmically sorted and the platform's not on an individual piece of content basis, but they want to prioritize engagement so they can sell more advertising around that. So therefore they are choosing in a way that the law doesn't seem to sort of understand. Why is it, I guess, that the platform is presumed to be a neutral arbiter here and certainly doesn't, the responsibility is put on the individual for the distribution of it when in fact whether it's very widely distributed or gets no distribution at all is ultimately a decision for the platform?
Great question. What we're seeing now in the European Union, at least at the moment, and we're going to, get into some of the seismic shifts that we're probably going to see globally around this later. There is a kind of framework being adopted that requires digital services providers to look at the risks that their platforms and their products can create and to take steps to mitigate them. So there's some really specific obligations, like there's some sort of transparency obligations and the obligation to kind of make terms and conditions kind of accessible and understandable. There's some out-of-court dispute resolution stuff if your account gets taken offline. But the paradigm that's sort of coming into place is around this risk assessment framework. And you're seeing that coming across not just in social media, but also in stuff like digital identity locally, AI systems as well. So that is kind of intended to make platform companies look at those recommender systems and think what could go wrong and to take steps to kind of mitigate that. So that's kind of the new regime that's coming into play. The reason for all of this intermediary liability stuff historically is not well understood in the public or even by policymakers. And there's some really interesting kind of commentators and legal professors who kind of publicly tear their hair out online because it's so poorly understood. And what the kind of premise of what they call Section 230 in the US was actually to enable two things. One is to actually enable online platforms to have user-generated content at all. Because if a online platform is all of a sudden taken to be the publisher of anything anybody puts on it, the sheer liability that could be created from that is just enormous. And what we're actually starting to see now in the United Kingdom is one of the examples that I've heard about, is some of the smaller sort of online communities are actually closing down. So they're saying, we've got these online safety duties and we just can't comply with them. Like, I think the example I heard was around a kind of forum for cyclists or something. And they were just saying like, look, I'm one dude, we're not monetized. I just can't monitor for all of this kind of stuff. The other important thing about Section 230 was it actually enables moderation. So the logic behind that is if I've got a whole bunch of content online and I'm taking some stuff down and leaving some stuff up, that invites the suggestion that the stuff I'm leaving up I endorse. So you have to kind of immunize the platforms almost to enable them to do any content moderation too. So it's kind of got an interesting history to it.
It's interesting, right? Because that is Section 230 is a foundational part of intellectual law, but it's predicated on a US kind of understanding of speech, and it's become de facto, foundational in other countries, even though they might have had very different kind of cultures and relationships to this, which we'll kind of return to shortly. Charles, I was wondering if you might be able to, because there's a piece of this that's missing, and I think quite well articulated in that Ministry of Culture and Heritage discussion document, which is that any attempt to regulate in this space has to kind of it has to interact with the various trade treaties to which we're party. And I think a lot of the time we think about regulation or legislation in isolation, but if we're legislating American companies within New Zealand, we have to think about the art of the possible, notwithstanding some recent developments, which we'll also get to. But can you kind of maybe give a sense of the kinds of things in a top line that we've signed up to, maybe with a little bit of kind of history about how they've kind of interacted with the internet, which is probably not necessarily the core of what we were thinking about when we were signing up.
Yeah, well, some of the rules that actually are at play go back to 1946, 47, when, of course, the internet had never even been dreamt of, and there were one or two computers, I think, around the globe. But again, they weren't really being thought of. But if you go back to the foundation document, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which was something we signed up to in 1947 or maybe early 48, there is actually Article 4, which is about film. And it was put there because the French and the Canadians, because some of the Canadians speak French, were very keen to be able to have rules in place to allow quotas to allow French language movies to not be dominated by English language movies. There was a big period where that was the only rule in place, but free trade agreements started to be negotiated in the 1980s, including for us the Australia-New Zealand CER agreement. The original CER from 82 didn't include services, but the 88 update did include rules for services, essentially agreeing that we would treat Australian companies as if they were New Zealand companies and vice versa. And this became very relevant 10 years later when the New Zealand industry decided to challenge the Australian quotas, broadcasting quotas, and through a court case around Project Blue Sky, and we won. Then we've had a whole succession of free trade agreements, which are increasingly focused in this space. So New Zealand has some rules that apply through these agreements, but also we've made commitments to those free trade agreements. So I tell one of my sideline activities is talking to university students about international trade law, and I suggest, instead of starting at the front of these agreements, you actually probably best to start at the back and look at the exception language and look at the commitments that we've made. And so we've basically carved out the work of the Film Commission and New Zealand On Air in all those agreements. So we're completely safe to continue operating with the existing framework. But if we're going to make changes, then it becomes more complicated. And we're talking about potentially making changes through this discussion document that MCH has published. And so we have to be very careful that we design whatever the new policies are with those international rules and international commitments at the forefront of our mind. And I was really pleased, because often this doesn't happen, but in this case, MCH did an excellent job of highlighting this issue.
So should we move to that MCH discussion document, which it's not a complete holistic solution to everything that we've been talking about, but certainly to my mind was the most broad-based and kind of just well thought through piece of it's not legislation, but as a kind of a framework for thinking about the complexities of what faces us now across multiple different areas. It was a pretty, I thought it was a pretty impressive piece of work. What did you make of it, Charles? And and obviously you've got a particular interest in the film and television side, which is absolutely impacted by it. So thinking about it with regard to some of those trade treaties, because it did talk about Netflix type organisations as well.
Yeah, well, there are 5 proposals, 5 areas of focus. Some of it I think is completely harmless and sensible. For example, making it essential that New Zealand content providers are featured when you buy a new television, smart television. Make sure that icon is there as well as the international icons. I don't worry too much about that. There's also some proposals around increased captioning and providing an ability, if you can't read, to hear what's on the screen. But then it gets a little bit more complicated. There's a proposal to merge the Film Commission and NZ On Air to be talked about, and I'm really interested in that one. It's something I think should have happened a long time ago.
You have Screen Australia, which has been around for I think more than 10 years.
Yeah, when I was on the board, we were talking about it as something that should be done, but the government of the day didn't have a particular appetite to do it. But my view is that increasingly we're talking about screen. Any policy should be neutral about what type of screen we're looking at, and having one entity there to support and help the industry grow is, I think, the way forward, and avoids duplication, etc. And we have one set of rules that everyone can work to, as opposed to right now where potentially you can game one organisation against the other and do better. Then there's also a discussion around how we can ensure that there is more New Zealand content on some platforms. I think there's a particular focus around the streaming services. And I think that's where it's going to get more difficult and more controversial, and where the international trade rules are going to have to be considered extremely carefully. Unfortunately, this is probably going to be a wider issue than just a straight trade law issue, as you've alluded to. We're living in very interesting times. I'm spending every evening reading on the latest coming out of the White House, and waking up in the morning and just seeing what's changed overnight. It's a very dynamic field. There's very much a focus on tariffs right now, but and a focus on Canada, China, and Mexico, but the administration in Washington has signaled that they want to look at everyone, and they're talking about a thing called reciprocal tariffs, and they're looking at all kinds of trade restrictions, or what they deem to be trade restrictions. Much to many people's amazement, they're talking about value-added taxes, for example. GST would be something they'll be looking at. But it could also be looking into the non-tariff measure space. And there is reference already to EU regulation of some of these platforms we're talking about. So I don't think we can avoid the potential for scrutiny, particularly given the timing of this discussion document being out there. And aside from the strict legal interpretations, we're probably going to have to consider how some of those people that you saw sitting behind Trump in the inauguration would react to New Zealand insisting on quotas, insisting on other policies that they wouldn't particularly like, and what that administration might do about that.
Yeah, so I do want to kind of get to that, because that is ultimately the backdrop against which this discussion plays out. And, much as I might consider this of huge urgency, reform in the media space, if it then has catastrophic flowing out impacts into all other aspects of your trade, then even the most kind of zealous person on media regulation would say that the juice probably isn't worth the squeeze at the moment. Tom, you've had a chance to read the MCH document?
I read sort of the one-page summary, so I haven't looked into it in a lot of detail, but I mean, as you would describe, like your summary of it as being a good document that has had a lot of thinking put into it is really encouraging to me, because I think one of the hardest things in this space, if we think about legislation or other sort of softer forms of regulation, is actually articulating a vision of what good looks like. Like, what are we actually aiming for? I'll look forward to reading a nice juicy policy document later.
Yeah, I mean, and that is the hard thing, because as much as like the EU has sort of led the way in some respects on technology regulation, there is a lot of, I think, fair-minded criticism of aspects of it about whether it is the kind of the philosophical approach that they're taking is actually good. The intentions are good, but whether it's a really hard to regulate space in general. I just wondered if you could maybe think about. This is a problem that's very broadly understood, and other countries are a lot more advanced than us. Australia has a lot of regulation either in action or proposed in this area. Is there anyone around the world or any particular kind of approach that you think has a chance to be, durable in a way that, something like the Harmful Digital Communications Act hasn't proven to be?
One of the difficulties with that is our domestic setup is so unique, I think. And I'm sure there's lots of arguments to be made about whether we are actually unique or not. But I mean, just as a starting point, the fact that we're a market of 5 million on a good day, and the fact that we need to consider local fundamentals like, the role of Te Tiriti or Waitangi, means that we're just kind of not that comparable to anyone, really. Like, you might look at Singapore or something as a comparable population size, but obviously the kind of historic legal culture there and the attitude to the role of the state and all that kind of thing is just fundamentally different. So it's pretty hard to point to any one regime as being one that works for us. I do think there's some kind of higher level structures that do make sense for us probably, and do mean that we'll be sort of interoperable or at least comparable with kind of the prevailing paradigms in the space. So two that stick out to me is obviously around this risk assessment type framework. Companies basically to comply with the EU regulation, and then also, even if there's no regulation in place, companies are doing risk assessments. They're thinking, even just from a kind of media fallout perspective, if I release this product and this happens, what am I going to do about it? So I think that's quite durable. I think thinking about the risks of a product and what you can do to mitigate them before you release it is a pretty durable framework that we can I don't think that's going to go anywhere. And then I think the other one that we can think about is around transparency. So I was the project lead for an international multi-stakeholder coalition called the Action Coalition on Meaningful Transparency. I didn't give it that name; it's a real mouthful. It was really interesting because it was technology companies like Meta, Google, you name it, they were probably in there. There was some international regulators. There were some international bodies like the OECD. Ofcom was in there. And then there was a lot of academics and think tanks as well. And what that was set up to do was to try and think about how we actually make transparency frameworks as a real cross-cutting global kind of mechanism actually meaningful, because there's a lot of, you have to give us this information, but there's a question about how you make that information useful to people. And the reason I like transparency as a regulatory framework is that it gives us information on which to actually understand what's going on with the platforms rather than going on kind of folklore and speculation. And then it gives us a way into articulating what we want to change.
Because it's interesting, right? Like when we went from that, I think it was a good point you made about the 2012 era Facebook as being sort of archetypal. That felt a lot more public. Like a lot of people could view the same thing, and you could see the level of engagement that a particular post generated. The fact that it was posts, it was text-based, helped that as well. And I always think about Facebook's purchase of CrowdTangle, which had which was a way of sort of surfacing what was popular on its platform. I think it bought it in around 2017. It is no longer functioning. They basically shut it down. And I don't think that was the intention when they bought it, but certainly that's...
I don't know. I think everybody thought that was where they were going eventually. I think it was waiting long enough to do that without causing too much of a fuss. The founder of CrowdTangle was part of this action coalition that we were leading, and there were lots of interesting discussions about CrowdTangle and how it works.
But there's certainly there it is, given how vastly popular these platforms are, the fact that it is so hard to know what is being seen at a global level, let alone down to sort of individual countries or regions. So your belief is that were that to be widely known, there would be a greater ability to have a rational discussion about the response to that.
In theory, obviously, like politics is not always a rational discussion about evidence, right? But at least we could be making like empirically valid claims about what is actually happening. Like if you think about the whole discussion in Australia around banning social media for under 16s, apart from YouTube for some reason, that's been the latest thing. There's a lot of open discussion about trying to assess, the different things that lead to the health status of a population of, a particular, young people or something. And there's lots of stuff that goes into that. Like, frankly, if you're reading the news today, your mental health would be impacted, even if you're not on social media. So there's just a lot that goes into that. And I think being able to have a kind of scientific basis for exploring, there's actually two things here. One is understanding what's happening now, and the second is actually being able to measure the impact of policy interventions too, because one of the things that comes up a lot in the kind of disinformation space is we don't actually know the impact of things like taking down networks of coordinated and authentic behaviour on Facebook. We take it all down, but then probably all the indications are that a lot of people just leave Facebook and go on to Telegram or some other messaging platform that's totally unmoderated as well.
So, Charles, just returning to the trade piece, because am I correct in understanding that where we talk about quotas, which are very commonplace, and certainly in Australia, they had this foundation of things like anti-siphoning law and quotas for local content on television, which are baked into the agreements, and therefore it's more natural to discuss them in a digital space. We didn't take that path. We've always been quite voluntary in terms of local content. Is the fact that we sort of essentially gave away some things that other countries held tightly part of why, it's going to be trickier and potentially impossible for us to then try and introduce a harder concept of a quota into a streaming platform environment?
Yeah, I think we've been operating in a very different paradigm from, say, the EU in New Zealand over our history. We're very much more sort of built along the principles that the United States, for example, would hold dearer in the space, and less regulation. We could have, if we had wanted, introduced quotas years ago and had exclusions for those quotas in our free trade agreements. We haven't got them, so yes, because we did not have those policies in place, it's going to be difficult to implement them potentially. So basically these free trade agreements, until now anyway, have in the services and investment space frozen in time the regulation that exists at the time the agreement is signed. So you can continue to operate a regime as described, but you can't go backwards and become more regulated in that space without having to renegotiate, or else you face a challenge. And most of these agreements have dispute settlement. So right now we're in a situation, and I'm not actually sure WTO rules apply that much. We need to worry about them too much in this space. But the dispute settlement mechanism there is totally dysfunctional because the Americans didn't allow the appeal judges to be reappointed, so there's no appellate system. We're going to have to renegotiate how that all works. But at the bilateral level, we still have dispute settlement in most cases, not with Australia. And it's interesting that with Australia and the quota issue came up with the Project Blue Sky case, it was the local courts that had to resolve the matter. So these agreements actually become part of domestic law, and so there is always potential recourse there. So the amount of policy room that we have is perhaps narrower than many other jurisdictions. I'm sure that something can be designed that will be consistent with most of our free trade agreements, but maybe not all. And sometimes when we do introduce policy, we've seen this in the investment space, there'll be a couple of jurisdictions that are carved out from that. And certainly with regard to Australia, we essentially have to treat Australian content as if it was New Zealand content in my interpretation. Interestingly, the elephant in the room is the United States, and we don't have a free trade agreement with the United States. We could have had one, but President Trump ripped it up when first day in the office in his first term and said it was the worst agreement ever. So there's actually no rules to constrain us vis-a-vis the United States other than our WTO commitments, and there's nothing they can do about that, given there's no dispute settlement mechanism in effect really there. It does occur to me that if the United States does have strong views in the space, this is actually another reason why maybe we should look at some bilateral discussion with them. So not just about tariffs and goods trade, but services, and maybe we can come up with something that could work for the world. So in every crisis there's an opportunity, and let's hope people are thinking creatively.
One of my questions was going to be, before you mentioned and the absence of any restrictions on our relationship with America was around this sort of transparency stuff. If New Zealand did introduce a bit of legislation tomorrow that basically created a framework where we could issue information requests or standardized reporting frameworks for large technology companies, my question was going to be, would trade law essentially prevent us from doing that? But obviously you sort of answered my question about the fact that we're basically like the Wild West when it comes to trade relationships with the US.
Well, you've got to be careful there because I would imagine that many of the larger companies have got subsidiaries in jurisdictions where there are free trade agreements. So there's always the potential that you could use the Singapore subsidiary to actually be the vehicle used to challenge something we do in New Zealand, or just use Singapore as an example. But there's plenty of opportunity to use somewhere else as the basis. And there is actually a bit of an issue around the world, people sort of gaming these free trade agreements and looking for the jurisdiction that suits them best, and they use that as the place where they challenge from.
I mean, that in some ways illustrates just why the internet is such a tricky, slippery thing to have out there when you have, the way that it inherently is used, the way that money flows through it and attention flows through it, and then the way that interacts with trade treaties that were designed with, pallets of kiwi fruit in mind, ultimately. Just before we do get into the elephant in the room, is there a so setting aside the kind of current administration there, Tom, do you have a sense of whether, through your work on the Action
Coalition on Meaningful Transparency, rolls off the tongue, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. That, there's always been this sort of scepter, and sometimes it's like it just sort of floats there, and sometimes it's like it's articulated in black and white, but that because New Zealand is small, that they can take or leave us. And so that if we were to, and this is where you sort of go, are we still sovereign in this space? Like, do we still have the ability to make laws here, even setting aside the whole trade agreements piece, because we have a population that is really into these services, and we have companies that are larger than us according to many dimensions. And, you saw this with, Google explicitly said it in terms of the Fair Digital News Bargaining Bill, that they might just withdraw from providing certain circumstances. And that provides a kind of almost unique level of political and business pressure. How real do you think that is as a sort of a whole separate lane for to understand these, is that they're almost keen to make an example of a country to show just how much they don't want to be regulated?
Yeah, I think they used Australia as that example pretty heavily for a while there.
And ended up blinking, at least in the first instance, right?
Yeah.
On their news bargaining bill.
Yeah. It's a pretty opinion-based thing, obviously. I mean, the premise of what the EU is doing around regulation is always, you read any of the policy papers around it or any of the commentary, and almost like the second sentence in any one of these things refers to the fact that the European Union is an economy with 450 million consumers. It's a pretty fundamental plank of their willingness to actually try and take the steps that they are. One of the points that I made about our safer online services and media platforms proposal, which is the sort of media and content moderation proposal that came out of the last government, was like our threshold for whether a platform would be regulated is whether it had like 100,000 regular users or something. So if you just stack up 450 million consumers versus 100,000, the scale is like, it's relevant. And to be honest, I mean, you're the one running a media business here, Like if you were looking at that from a business perspective and you had to fundamentally change your technological systems in order to cater to a market of 5 million, if it were me, I would probably pull out and just be pretty comfortable with that. So honestly, I do think it's a threat. I don't think that means that we have to do nothing, though. So one other thing for me is that we tend to jump towards the idea of legislation as being the main kind of regulatory tool that we have. I think instead we should be thinking a lot more about, I don't want to say softer, but like less, lower in the hierarchy things. So there is, one example of that was the Christchurch call. So, for example, a diplomatic thing that involves multi-stakeholder collaboration around a really strong foundational commitment to a set of sort of norms and principles can have a really big impact. So I think
did the Christchurch call have a really big impact?
I think it did. And my source for that was actually chatting to so we looked into this for the New Zealand Superannuation Fund. And I remember speaking to a New Zealand regulator who I won't name, who basically said, yeah, it's had a really big impact. And what I'm talking about there is the content incident protocol. So that's the one that they kick into gear when there's an active Christchurch-like situation. Right. And that rips everything down really fast to the point where actually when you're trying to go and look for the information afterwards to do regulatory functions, you can't even find it.
Yeah, I mean, like that's a sort of narrow but deep thing. I don't know if that the breadth of what the Christchurch call presented as at the time, I'm not sure.
I think if there was this kind of wider thing where they were talking about basically I don't think they were ever talking about completely removing terrorist content from the internet, because everybody that knows anything knows that that's a futile goal. Some of the stated kind of objectives were around basically reducing algorithmic radicalization. I think there's a probably pretty good argument to say that some really good stuff came out of that. But again, you can't get to a state where nobody is radicalized online. It's an impossible goal.
Certainly doesn't seem like that has lessened in recent years, depending on your definition of radicalization, which is obviously why this stuff is hard.
Yep.
Charles, let's move into the main course. You've been observing trade and bilateral, multilateral attempts to kind of reorganize how countries relate to one another through those means for some time. What has the last few weeks looked like for you in terms of, the kind of what you observed versus what we're going through at the moment?
Well, it's absolutely terrible. So everything that has underpinned my belief system in my profession has been turned upside down by what is going on. And I quip to my friends that I'm so glad I'm not actually still working in the government, because at least I can speak my mind publicly, whereas they can't, and it must be terribly frustrating. And I'm not just talking about for New Zealand and officials from jurisdictions outside the United States. I just feel so much for those who are working inside the UN system, who know that what is being done is not what should be done, but they have to be professional and or else resign and get out. So it's a very difficult situation that they're in. But for a medium-sized country like New Zealand, it's essential that we have international rules that are going to be enforceable, and that we can operate with full knowledge that those are the rules and people will respect them. And this is not just in the trade space, but in the international political and international security space as well. And this has just all been upended. What Russia has done vis-a-vis Ukraine has been a challenge to that system at one level. And now we're getting very unpredictable and strange noises out of Washington around Greenland or around Canada and around Panama Canal. There's a sort of an imperialistic element now to US policy that certainly wasn't anticipated during the election campaign. And certainly this America First philosophy seems to be what is driving what is going on in the trade space. But pretty much everything that President Trump has enacted to date is, in my view, inconsistent with WTO commitments and inconsistent with the bilateral commitments that have been made under the US MCA agreement. It used to be called NAFTA, which Trump altered last time around. And the proposals that have yet to be fully explained around reciprocal tariffs, and I don't know why we're using the term reciprocal, because it seems to be a one-way action. It's not as if the US is going to be changing policy. Will be breaching a whole lot of other commitments as well. So you've got one of the major players acting with impunity, able to ignore the international rules. It is very disturbing for someone who thinks about these issues from New Zealand. Businesses really like certainty. You're not going to make big investment decisions in an uncertain environment, and this is just a totally uncertain world. We're in that right now, both politically and economically, and we just don't know whether something that's been implemented or announced is actually going to be implemented. And if it's been implemented, is it going to be changed within 36 hours? That seems to have happened with auto tariffs anyway, and between Canada, Mexico, and the United States. It's all a big mess. Fortunately for New Zealand, we don't seem to be the target of anything yet in the space. I think that Trump kind of likes us, and that's important. You can see that he likes Australia, he likes the UK. They're treated very differently from Canada and Europe. I'm not quite sure what Canada did wrong, but so I think we're doing everything right. We're not saying much. We're studying. We're obviously lobbying really hard in Washington so that people understand that actually US tariffs are higher than our tariffs on US tariffs on New Zealand are higher than our tariffs are on US product in general, and that our trade is basically imbalanced. We're not the problem they're trying to address, but it is very disturbing, and goodness knows where it's all going to lead.
Do you think that it feels almost inevitable that at some point, it's almost like you're in a, one of those sort of Mission Impossible kind of trying to break into a room kind of thing with lasers everywhere, that at some point you're going to trigger one of them. It's a long term, assuming that it survives it, and it doesn't have to be real for it to draw attention. You know what I mean? Like, because there's so much of this is actually just surfaced on X, and it doesn't have to be through an official channel for an action or a reaction to come. Like, is there a sort of, because what we've witnessed so far has been, just this incredible barrage of outward actions from the US, and we haven't yet seen people sort of process that and think about what they might do in return, or to kind of operate in this new environment in a way that kind of can both not poke the bear but also kind of defend your sort of national interest and sovereignty and ability to kind of just run a rational country. Have you sort of had thoughts or conversations that sort of make you think, hey, is there a kind of the opportunity for an emergent order that routes around the sort of chaos machine in Washington?
Well, we've already seen a near trigger of one of those laser beams with fake news around our policy vis-a-vis Israelis coming to New Zealand.
Correct.
That was handled very well, I think. Government responded real fast, and embassy spoke to the senator concerned, and that seems to have gone away. But that just demonstrates how fragile this all is. So yes, it could be something that is just talked about in a parliamentary debate, which isn't going to, in most probability, become government policy. Could be picked up and fired around on social media, and all of a sudden we've got a big problem. The other thing that's a bit of a concern is my understanding that embassies around the world in the United States system have been tasked with finding these issues they should be raising. In the case of New Zealand, if you look at the United States Trade Representative's website, they have an annual report on their US trading partners and what they do right and what they do wrong. The section on New Zealand is like 2 paragraphs, and they're very small paragraphs. Basically, we're the dream trade partner. We're just not doing anything that they dislike. There'll be some stuff around the pharmaceutical purchase regime, as you know, and those things that were taken out of TPP when it became CPTPP because we were hoping to encourage the United States back in. But it's all very, very minor stuff. And what concerns me a little bit about what we're talking about today is this is the type of issue that actually could be seized upon and will not go down well in certain quarters, even though this is just a discussion document. Who knows what New Zealand policy is going to be like at the end of the day. And it could become a problem for us. So, once we do have a policy determined, we'll have to think about how it is explained and how it is negotiated with trading partners. We're miles away from that at this stage, but this is the sort of thing that could become a big issue, which would be most unfortunate.
Tom, you'll also have been processing this and thinking about, you have spent years deeply thinking about ways to sort of how to, for our society, our politics, our culture, to interact with platforms that are semi-oblivious to it, but having a huge role here. How have you been sort of, when you're watching the way this is playing out and thinking about this, if not a life's work, like a big chunk of it as being made far more difficult, far more delicate than it might have been a year ago with this new doctrine? What has your response to it been?
So as Charles was talking, I was thinking about how to some extent we kind of already do this kind of really careful Mission Impossible type thing with respect to other countries too. So, China really comes to mind for me. Like, obviously, we're pretty careful about what we do and what we say, and we, one of the takeaways from a prior delegation that I went on was just how much countries have been planning for a new Trump administration and thinking about diversifying their relationships with other countries so that they can start to kind of maneuver around these great powers, basically, because, I guess the US is something that we're treating a little bit more cautiously now, but I guess we've sort of been doing that for a while with the sort of rise of the great powers. I think something that I'm thinking a lot about at the moment, and it sort of goes back to your comment before about sovereignty. If I were to be really optimistic about what we're seeing right now, what I would hope for is a greater awareness and an understanding of how these technological systems work and alternatives to them. So, this doesn't work so much when we're talking about sort of media policy and subsidies and quotas and some of the stuff you've been discussing. But when it comes to just fundamentally sort of artificial intelligence and technologies and communication systems, what would be a truly amazing outcome of what we're seeing now is this greater understanding of the technological systems that we're using and a greater willingness by people to try and understand how they work and how they can use them in ways that are much more kind of empowering. So, for example, thinking about sort of open source alternatives to these technology platforms, or thinking about open standards that mean that you can have greater competition in the markets for social media platforms, those kinds of things. So, I guess my really kind of thought leadery, starry-eyed, future-focused take would be, wouldn't it be great if the way that we reacted to looking at all of this is we went, okay, technology is really powerful. We want some agency and some sovereignty over how it's being developed, designed, deployed, used. So what we need to do is we really need to grapple with understanding the nuts and bolts of all of this and I guess also the governance of it, and actually build stuff that suits us better and reflects our values. And I think that still gives us the opportunity to basically interface with the rest of the world because there's sort of standardized, interoperable platforms, and then to have a bit more choice too. So that would be my optimistic take.
It does. It's a nice note to end on, and we will end it there. My fear would just be that the incentives around the large technology platforms, which have spent a long, long time and many billions of dollars building walled gardens and containing and owning their audience, why would they willingly cede that relationship? So it would have to be new things that are being built almost upon those ideals to pry the audiences away.
I can test. I'll throw some things out there just to test that a little bit. One of the things coming out of the EU is they're not just doing sort of digital services stuff. They're also doing competition-related stuff, and so some of that involves requirements to use sort of interoperable formats and to let you sort of what's called data portability, so being able to take all your data with you. There's some initiatives that are actually being set up by industry, including in the US. One's called the Data Transfer Initiative. And that's basically the companies going, okay, well, data portability is probably where the world's going, so we should try and think about how this is actually going to work. And that has actually resulted in some actual stuff you can use to take all your services from sort of Google to Meta, I think. There's one where you could take all of your playlists from one sort of streaming service to another. So I do think that we are going to go in that direction. And the other thing is sort of Meta, of all people, are the ones who are really championing open source AI, right?
Yeah.
So I think long term, the kind of people that run this stuff do understand that technology needs to be interoperable, and even Threads, right, is designed around a protocol that eventually will let you sort of take all your data with you. So I hear what you're saying about the kind of walled garden thing, but there are indicators that we can be more hopeful than that.
Yeah. Look, I hope that your hope is proven right. I do fear that both the things you're describing is where Meta was late, and Meta has when it's late, it has an interest in there being competition. Where it was early, or where it has a dominant position, it behaves very differently. But look, I appreciate you both so much for coming back and having these two pieces discussed alongside one another and looking at the ways they interact has been really fascinating. We're sort of both late and early on all this stuff, and so no doubt we'll speak again. But yeah, thank you, Charles and Tom, for coming out.
Thank
really
you very
appreciate
much.
it.
Great pleasure.
Thanks for having us.